Welcome to the deep dive. We're tackling Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan today.
Oh, yeah. Going to be fun diving into his thoughts on human nature and society and all that.
Definitely. We've got the essential excerpts right here, ready to go.
Cool, cool. Our goal is to basically give you a crash course in Hobbes so you can,
Impress your friends and parties.
exactly, or at least sound like you know what you're talking about when someone brings them up.
Right. So let's jump right in. Hobbes goes pretty hard on superstition right from the start.
Yeah, he's got some thoughts about how fear of spirits and blind faith can be used to manipulate people, especially,
The simple people, as he calls them.
yeah.
Not exactly the most sensitive term, but
Yeah, and before anyone gets too offended, he's not saying everyone's easily fooled.
it's more about how those in power or those trying to get power use those fears.
Right. They exploit what people already believe to push their own agendas. Hobbes was especially skeptical of anyone claiming to speak for God.
Definitely. He was all about reasoned faith, not just blindly accepting things. It's interesting, though, he lumps dreams and prophecies in with superstition.
Interesting, yeah. It makes you wonder what he'd say about today's world, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
Targeted ads, algorithms, echo chambers online, where you only see what you already agree with.
It's like these algorithms know our fears better than we do, which actually connects to what Hobbes talks about next, the limits of human imagination.
Okay, so how does that work?
So he says we can't really grasp the concept of infinity, only our own inability to understand something that has no end.
Like trying to picture a universe that just keeps going and going?
Exactly. Our minds kind of short circuit. And Hobbes says this applies to how we understand God, too. The name's more about respect than a definition.
So we can't really box in God with our limited human understanding.
Nope. And this limitation, he argues, it's everywhere. Even our most complex thoughts, they all come from our senses or experiences.
Which brings us to another big one for Hobbes. Language. He was convinced that language is crucial for thought.
Especially for abstract ideas, stuff like time, justice, truth. Those aren't exactly things you can touch.
Right, they're concepts. And Hobbes uses the example of what he calls a natural fool, someone who can't count past 10 without messing up.
To show that even basic stuff needs language to make sense, which is super relevant for us today, even more so than in Hobbes' time.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, think about it. Algorithms, coding, AI, it's all built on language.
It's all about manipulating language in a very specific way to create the digital world we live in.
Which Hobbes would have some thoughts about, I'm sure. But he didn't stop at language as a tool. He also warned about letting our emotions and biases get in the way.
Totally. He pointed out how words like wisdom or cruelty can mean totally different things depending on who's using them.
And who they're talking about.
Exactly. And that's where it gets tricky, because if everyone's interpretation is different, how can you ever agree on anything?
It's like we're all speaking slightly different versions of the same language.
Right. And this actually ties into another point Hobbes makes about emotions in general, especially sudden ones. He talks about how we laugh when we're surprised, cry when we lose hope.
But those feelings, they fade over time. You don't see people crying over yesterday's news.
Unless it's about the latest viral video or something, maybe. But you get the point. These strong emotions, they're fleeting. Hobbes didn't have to deal with social media and the 24/7 news cycle, but it makes you wonder what he'd say about how those things amplify our emotions, even the fleeting ones.
It's like we're living in a constant state of Hobbesian laughter and tears, just scrolling through our phones.
And that brings us to another fun aspect of human nature that Hobbes was fascinated by: ambition.
Ah, yes, ambition, the driving force behind so much of history, good and bad.
For sure. And Hobbes thought that people who overestimate their own political skills, they're especially prone to getting a little too ambitious, especially if they're good at talking and persuading people.
The politicians, the influencers, the thought leaders, always in the spotlight.
Exactly. They need to be seen, heard, validated. And it makes you wonder, are they really trying to make a difference or just feeding their own egos?
A very Hobbesian question. And it makes you wonder, are we all driven by the same basic urges as people were back then, even if the way we express them is different now? That's a lot to think about.
It is, and we're just getting started.
So we were talking about ambition before and how it plays into, well, pretty much everything.
Yeah, ambition, fear, this need to understand where we fit in the grand scheme of things, it all kind of ties together.
And that's where religion comes in, right? I mean,
Yeah.
we were starting to get into Hobbes's take on how religion comes about.
Right, right. And this is where things get really interesting, because Hobbes wasn't exactly known for his warm and fuzzy feelings about, well, much of anything.
Definitely not known for being sentimental. So how does religion fit into his worldview?
Well, remember how we talked about superstition and how it can be used to manipulate people? He saw those as kind of the building blocks of organized religion.
So we're hardwired for meaning-making, but that same impulse can lead us down some pretty interesting paths.
Exactly. And Hobbes was really interested in how this human need to make sense of things, especially things we don't understand, intersects with power structures.
Okay, so it's not just about whether God exists or not. It's about who gets to control the narrative about God, right?
You got it. And think about it. Throughout history, religion has been used for both good and bad, to unite people and to control them.
So where does Hobbes land on all of that?
He was very wary of anyone claiming to have a monopoly on divine truth, especially if those claims came with, say, an army or a lot of political influence.
Which brings us to another area where Hobbes wasn't afraid to ruffle some feathers.
Yeah.
His views on government.
Oh yeah, this is where things get really real and actually really relevant for us today.
Because,
Well, Hobbes argued that the only way to escape the chaos of a world without rules, a world he called the state of nature.
sounds terrifying.
It kind of is. He described it as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Basically a constant war of everyone against everyone else.
Okay, so how do we avoid that? Seriously, asking for a friend.
Well, Hobbes' solution wasn't exactly democratic, let's put it that way.
Oh.
He believed that the only way to ensure peace and stability was through a strong, centralized authority. One ruler, one set of laws, no backtalk.
That sounds a little intense.
He was writing in a time of a lot of upheaval, remember, civil wars, religious conflicts. He'd seen what happens when societies break down.
So for him, it was a trade-off. We give up some freedom in exchange for security.
That was his argument. Now, whether or not you agree with that, it's a question that's still debated today.
Right. I mean, it makes you think about where we draw the line between individual liberty and collective safety. Big questions.
Big questions indeed. But back to Hobbes and religion. Where does faith fit into all of this talk about absolute rulers and giving up some freedoms?
Because I have a feeling he didn't see the church as this separate, untouchable entity.
You would be right. Hobbes was basically like, look, even God needs someone to enforce the rules. He argued that ultimate power, even in matters of faith, had to rest with the sovereign.
So much for the separation of church and state.
Pretty much. He saw any kind of power struggle between secular and religious authorities as a recipe for disaster.
Because if everyone's interpreting God's will differently, who gets to decide who's right?
Exactly. And for Hobbes, any challenge to the ruler's authority was basically a one-way ticket back to chaos, which he was not down for.
This is all very intellectually stimulating, but I have to admit, a bit heavy on the doom and gloom. Is there any room for, I don't know, hope in Hobbes' philosophy?
Well, that's a great question, and it brings us to a really interesting contradiction at the heart of Hobbes' thought. For all his talk about the darkness of human nature, there's this one area where he gets surprisingly quiet.
Intriguing. Tell me more.
For all his talk about mortality, about life being nasty, brutish, and short, he never comes right out and says whether he believes in an afterlife or not.
So, no pearly gates or fire and brimstone in Hobbes' world.
He seems to have preferred leaving that particular mystery up to individual interpretation. His focus was on making this life here and now a little less terrible.
Which, honestly, is a goal I think we can all get behind.
Right. I mean, who wouldn't want a world with a little less nasty and a little more not constantly at each other's throats?
Sign me up. But if even a mind as brilliant as Hobbes' struggled with these big existential questions, where does that leave us? We're just a couple of podcast hosts trying to make sense of it all.
That, my friend, is the million-dollar question, and one we're going to explore further after a quick break to gather our thoughts.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Superstition, fear, power, even touched on the whole God question.
It's a lot to process, for sure.
That's Hobbes for you. Never one to shy away from the big, messy stuff.
He just goes there. And, you know, in a way, it's refreshing.
Right. It's like he's saying, look, we can debate the finer points of the afterlife later, but first, let's figure out how to not destroy ourselves.
Exactly. There's this very practical side to his thinking, even when he's talking about pretty dark stuff. Like, how do we create a society where people aren't constantly terrified for their survival?
Which, let's be real, is a pretty relatable concern, even centuries later.
Totally. And that's what makes Leviathan so fascinating. It's not just some dusty old philosophy book. It speaks to something very human, very timeless.
Okay, but we have to acknowledge some of his ideas, especially about absolute power, they can be tough to swallow.
For sure, for sure. I don't think anyone's advocating for a Hobbesian dictatorship anytime soon.
Definitely not. But that's not really the point, is it?
No. The point is that he makes you think. He gives you this framework for understanding how power works, how ambition plays out, both on a grand scale and in our everyday lives.
It's like he's holding up a mirror showing us all the good, the bad, and the ugly.
And then he challenges us to do something with that reflection, to build systems, to make choices that account for all of it.
So, less about agreeing with every single thing he said, more about using his ideas as a starting point for our own thinking.
Exactly. Think of it like a mental workout. Hobbes gives you the weights, you decide how you want to use them to build your own intellectual muscles.
I like that. So how do we actually do that? How do we take these big, abstract ideas and apply them to our lives?
Well, first off, just being aware of them is huge. Once you start recognizing those patterns of behavior, those power dynamics that Hobbes was talking about, you see them everywhere.
In politics, in the media, even in our personal relationships, right?
Everywhere. And once you start seeing those patterns, it's harder to ignore them. It makes you question things, think critically about the information you're taking in, about the choices you're making.
So Hobbes is like this secret weapon for navigating a world that's constantly trying to tell you what to think, what to believe.
Precisely. And in a world overflowing with information, with everyone from politicians to like influencers vying for your attention.
You need all the help you can get to cut through the noise.
Right. You have to be discerning, think for yourself. And those are skills that, honestly, engaging with Hobbes can help you develop.
So to wrap things up, what's the one big takeaway you hope our listeners walk away with today?
I'd say it's this. Don't be afraid to question everything. Don't take anything at face value, whether it's coming from a politician, a religious leader, or even a talking head on TV. Engage with ideas, even the uncomfortable ones. Think for yourself. That's the best way to honor the legacy of a thinker like Hobbes, even if you don't always agree with him.
Couldn't said it better myself.
No.
And on that note, we're wrapping up this deep dive into the world of Thomas Hobbes.
Hope you enjoyed the ride.
Until next time, keep those minds sharp. And remember, question everything.